We're in Luke chapter 21 this morning, and this is one of the Lord's prophetic discourses. And I'd begun into the end of the introductory comments last week. I think it might have been about as clear as mud, and so I think I'm going to jump into the text. But if you would, I'd like to ask that you would bow with me in prayer as we begin this class. Lord, we give thanks for this beautiful, beautiful day that's dawned. We're thankful that we can gather in peace and safety within our persons. And we recognize that there are a lot of innocent people around the world who do not have this luxury. In addition to, of course, the war that we're all being shown on television, there are others, and there are other tyrants in the world that take advantage of people that are innocent. We just pray that you would bless the people in Europe, Eastern Europe, bless our leaders, that they would be judicious and wise and hold to the principles that made the country great, those things that are based upon your word and within your will. We pray that you'd bless our study together this morning, and that the things that are said and done will meet with your approval. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Let me begin. I just would like to read that again and get that clear before us. Chapter 21 of Luke, and starting at verse 5. The widow's mite had been given, and then begin verse 5 and said, while some were talking about the temple, that it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts, he said, as for these things which you are looking at, the days will come in which there will not be left one stone upon another which will not be torn down. They questioned him, saying, Teacher, when therefore will these things happen? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? And he said, I want you to take note of verses 8 and 9. And he said, see to it that you are not misled. For many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is near. Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and disturbances, do not be terrified, for these things must take place, but the end does not follow immediately. Then he continued by saying to them, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be great earthquakes, and in various places plagues and famines, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. But before all of these things, they will lay their hands on you and will persecute you and deliver you to the synagogues and prisons, bringing you before kings and governors for my name's sake. It will lead to an opportunity for your testimony. So make up your minds not to prepare beforehand to defend yourselves, for I will give you utterance and wisdom, which none of your opponents will be able to resist or refute. But you will be betrayed even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. And you will be hated by all because of my name. Yet not a hair on your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your lives. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in the midst of the city must leave, and those who are in the country must not enter the city, because these are days of vengeance, so that all things which are written will be fulfilled. Woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress upon the land and wrath to this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword, and will be captive and led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So it's an ominous, ominous thing. And he's speaking to them about Jerusalem and the war between the Jews and the Romans. At that time, when this is taking place, the temple in Jerusalem, owing to its massive size and its grandeur, was one of the wonders of the world. For about 1,000 years since Solomon built the first temple on Temple Mount in 965 BC, it was, except during the Babylonian captivity, That was 586 to 537, and the period of desecration by Antiochus Epiphanes in 168 to 165 BC. Except for those two periods, this temple was the center of religious life among God's chosen people. And apart from the element of fraud that had crept in over the centuries and dominated, really, there was also, nevertheless, year in and year out, faithful Jews who came to that temple and worshiped God. In other words, most of it was just as corrupt as it could be, but there was that remnant, that righteous remnant who continued to come, and people of great piety who sought and worshiped the Lord in that place. And how gloriously God had frequently revealed himself there to the faithful, not to the least of which is the call that Isaiah, office of a prophet, in Isaiah chapter 6. He was in the temple. You remember Zechariah was a priest, and there are just different times that God has spoken to his faithful in that place. Already long before Jesus' coming upon the earth, God announced that he, that is Jesus, the messenger of the covenant, the divine Messiah, is going to come to that temple. He said that in Malachi chapter 1. Chapter 3, rather, verse 1. And at that coming, he was coming to purge and to judge what was going on there. Malachi chapter 3, verses 2 to 5. So this is centuries before his arrival in great detail. Now, Luke had already described how the Savior had not merely come among the Jewish people. He's already described how he came into the temple as the Messiah. And he had purged it rather dramatically of evil practices which defiled it, and frequently in the porticos and what have you taught great multitudes of people. Begin early in the morning, and they would be there, and they would come and listen to what he had to say. And so he had vigorously proclaimed himself to be the Messiah and had articulated his divine mission, just as the prophet said. His opponents proved, no matter how many opportunities they were given, they proved that they were persistently determined they're going to reject him. They're not going to have him. And they've done that over and over and over. And by doing that, they sealed their own fate, the fate of the city and the fate of the temple. He's doing everything that he can do right up to, even after he's been crucified and resurrected, he is trying to help them avoid what's coming. There are storm clouds gathering, and they refuse to see that. So when the disciples spoke about the elegance of the temple, Jesus expressly announced that this beautiful building is going to be completely and utterly destroyed. And through his personal advent to the people, his arrival, and to the temple, the old dispensation by which God was to be worshiped by outward ceremony and sacrifices in the temple, that had come to an end. 6 centuries before, in Jeremiah, chapter 31, I believe. Yes, chapter 31 and verse 31, 6 centuries now before he came, it says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant which I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. But this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people." So 6 centuries before the arrival of Jesus, it's been announced that a new covenant is going to be given. a new system is going to be established. And these Jews should have known that. They no doubt had read Jeremiah, but they didn't read it with understanding. And so they're refusing God's Messiah. And because the Jewish leaders have rejected him, and the vast majority of the people are just, what the leaders said, they went with. And you wonder how much independent thought they did before they took that position. Sometimes if you got a person that's credentialed and he's wearing academic robes, and we don't do that, but some religions do, they'll wear the academic robes and what have you when they walk in the pulpit. And people, and all of that is for effect, and people will tend to let that guy do the thinking. That's never a very good policy. Not a very good policy at all in any matter that I'm associated with in life. And so many of the people, if they didn't reject him outright, they were merely interested in him, and they didn't accept him or receive him as their Messiah. And so they joined in very readily with their leaders when they urged a Gentile judge to have him crucified. Now you think about the enormity of that the Jews are asking a Gentile, pagan Gentile, to crucify, at least they could recognize him as a teacher, as a rabbi. And so that brings great guilt down upon them. And for that reason, the Lord said, this temple's going to be destroyed. And the city surrounding it's going to be destroyed as a judgment upon the spiritual blindness and as a proof that the old dispensation is gone once and for all, and they've got to make room for the new dispensation. He got them out of the temple, didn't he? They wouldn't receive their Messiah. They wouldn't respond in a positive way after all he had done. I mean, you think about his ministry, the great signs, wonders, and miracles, citing the prophets to them and saying, this is the fulfillment of that, showing them, leading them by the hand. And he'd done everything that he could do, lays his life down and pays the sin debt that they and all the rest of us have incurred, and still they're going to reject him. And so as a result of that, he says the judgment has come. Because one greater than the temple has come, and because the people have rejected him and desire to retain the temple as the center of their own religion, because at this point it's their religion, certainly not his, there's no other alternative. That's got to be taken out of the way. That's got to be destroyed, and the unbelieving people visited with doom are going to be destroyed, which he had sought, he'd sought to avert that for them. Work mightily to deliver them from that, because he knew what was coming. When he speaks these words in this prophetic utterance, he knows in a short 4 decades what's going to take place. And now they have sealed their own fate. And when he tells the disciples about this, they immediately accept what he says as being the truth. And maybe it is their earthly and nationalistic messianic expectations. They had a different idea than what Jesus was telling them about how that was going to be. They thought that the temple, perhaps, when he says this, is going to be destroyed in order to build a more grandiose messianic temple and establish, his kingdom on the earth. And so, in any case, the desire to know when these events would take place and what sign there might be to indicate that it is imminent, the disciples, when they asked this question, no doubt thought that the destruction of the temple is going to take place at the same time as the Messiah comes, and that's the end of it. That's what they were thinking, because that's what a lot of the Jews thought. And then it'd be the end of the world, and he'd establish his eternal kingdom. Matthew 24, verse 3. Jesus warns them. Verses 8 and 9, and I called attention to him. He warns them there not to expect the second coming so soon. He's trying to disabuse them of something that they've been taught probably all their lives, And it's based on a misunderstanding, and he's trying to clarify that. So don't look for it. It's not close at hand. It also, when they hear of wars and insurrections among the nations, they must not be terrified and imagine that that's necessarily an indication of the end. Because all these events, he says, will take place, but the end will not come so soon. Everybody's concerned, and should be, with the war that's going on in Eastern Europe. How many wars do you think from the time Jesus spoke to now have taken place? There's been 2 world wars that we had prominent participation in. And I'm trying to think, in my lifetime, there was the Vietnam War, and there was the invasion of Grenada, and there was the war in Iraq, and the war in Afghanistan. There are others in there that I can't name just now. You've heard me say a lot of times, one of my best friends was a special operations soldier, and I asked him one time, how many operations had he been in, how many countries did he visit? He said, I really don't know. A lot. And so I'm not minimizing, I'm just saying that has been going on. And Jesus said, don't look for the end to come with that. He said, all these events are going to take place, but the end is not so soon. In verse 10, after the Savior has thus warned the disciples against being misled by people or events, he outlines in verses 10 through 19 all the things that are going to happen before the destruction of the city of Jerusalem takes place. If you look at the way Matthew deals with this prophetic utterance in chapter 24 of Matthew, there was a couple of questions the disciples asked. And when he divides it, he answers kind of like here about the destruction of Jerusalem, and then he comes to verse 36 to talk about the end, and he said, of that day and that hour knows no man but the Father only. And so, verse 10, after he's warned the disciples, then he's going to give some signs about what's going to happen in Jerusalem. First, he said there will be commotion and strife among the nations. Now, that's a general statement. What was he referring to? Well, probably what he's referring to especially is the Jewish insurrection against the Roman occupation. That has been cooking and bubbling. And finally, in 66 A.D., it breaks out fully into warfare, into struggle. And then there is the struggle between the Palestinian Jews and the Roman Empire. And finally, it leads to the total destruction, utter destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70, just like he said. Moreover, before the final downfall of the temple and the Jewish kingdom, he said there will be great earthquakes, there will be famines, there will be pestilences, terrifying signs, things that actually we know did occur. You can historical writers write about those events in the years preceding the destruction of the Jewish temple. Verse 12, before these things happen, however, Jesus is very, very explicit and very plain. He said the disciples will undergo some very dark days and difficult times. And this took place just as Jesus prophesied. The Church of Christ had hardly been established when the persecutions commenced. And you go back with me over to the book of Acts and the book of John. Peter and John were taken and summoned to appear before the Jewish council. That's Acts chapter 4. And all the apostles were arrested and imprisoned in Acts chapter 5, verse 17 and forward. And chapter 5 and verse 40, they suffered a beat down. Shortly afterwards, Stephen was stoned to death in chapter 6 of Acts, verse 8 and forward. Then Saul of Tarsus came persecuting the Christians and delivering them into the hands of the Jewish leaders and dragged them off to prison and dragged them off to death. Subsequently, James, the brother of John, was killed by King Herod in Acts chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. And so when he's talking about these things, it happened. And it happened before the destruction of the temple. Paul as well as other Christians, was dragged before pagan governors and judges and persecuted in the synagogues and subjected to many forms of ill treatment after his conversion. And thus all that Jesus prophesied, all his predictions in this regard came true in the first years after his ascension and before the Jewish-Roman War broke out. You know, there are folks that are that will point to the events today and say, that's already been fulfilled. It's made Mr. Hagee, I'm sure, a wealthy man over at San Antonio to point to various current events and say this is what was being talked about, but it was manifestly not. Now, do some of those kind of events still occur? Yes, and I suspect until Jesus comes again, there are going to be wars and rumors of wars and pestilence and earthquakes and volcanic eruptions and all of those things. But here, in this instance, he said, these things will take place, and you will know that the approaching destruction, it took place in AD 70. He didn't give him a date, but he said it's imminent. Verse 13, he tells them, but look here, y'all. He didn't say, look here, y'all. He said, but he calls their attention. He said, notice, those things, as unpleasant as they are going to give you an opportunity, give all the faithful an opportunity to bear witness to the honor of their Redeemer and to the redemption from God sent through his promised Messiah. You know, within those terrible times, there are opportunities that you might not otherwise have. And so he reminds them of that. And in the history of the apostles and other members of the first Christian churches, these words of Jesus were also again fulfilled. Early on. Verses 14 and 15, believers, however, he said, should not be anxious about what they're going to say and the defense that they're going to make when they are thus summoned to appear before the Jewish and the pagan authorities. He said, don't worry about it, because Jesus himself, through his Spirit, Mark chapter 13, verse 11, will give them the necessary words and the wisdom which their opponents will be unable to refute. They're not going to be able to handle what you say to them. And again, why are they doing that? Well, he is trying to give these people an opportunity to be redeemed, because he came to seek and save the what? The lost. And so he continues to do that, and his disciples do that after he's ascended to the Father. And of course, this was also fulfilled during the years after Jesus' ascension. Again and again and again, it appeared that the persecutors of the faithful were not able to make an adequate response to the defense that they made. They couldn't overthrow it. The compelling logic with which they presented themselves and the things that they had to say, they could not answer that. And from that, however, it doesn't follow that the people were acquitted. Now, you would think they would be acquitted, but it is similar to what we're seeing, in Eastern Europe right now. The Russian dictator, whatever comes out of his mouth thus far has not been true. Says he's not doing this, he's doing that. So you can just about write that down. Well, there again, I'm not making light of it, but that's not a new phenomenon. And so they didn't always exonerate these people just because they were telling the truth, and they couldn't gainsay what they were saying. On the contrary, their persecutors were generally filled with such blind hatred towards them that even though they could prove nothing against them, they condemned them anyway to be imprisoned, to be beaten, and even in many instances to be put to death. And you think, oh, how could they do that? Well, whenever the authorities were asking us to take precautions when COVID came along, and people in some places almost went to blows. Our brethren, I think, weathered that better than a lot, but there were a couple of churches that reported, a couple of guys wanting to call each other out on the parking lot and whatever because of that disagreement that they had. That was a real good display before the world, wasn't it? Converted a lot of people as a result of that. And that's just on a much lower scale. But I'm saying, if you look at human nature, that's what will happen sometimes. And so it's what I want to take away from that is not say, well, those Jews were really inadequate there. They were. And I can be the same way. If I come to a question and my mind is not open and my heart is not open, and I've already got my mind made up, and don't confuse me with the facts, you adopt that kind of attitude, you can go right down that same rabbit hole that these people did. Because a lot of these people are devoutly religious people, and their rabbis have said there's nothing to that Jesus guy, that he's a apostate, he's a blasphemer, he's this, he's that, and they said the same thing then about his disciples. Was that true? It wasn't true. The pagans said they were cannibals because they didn't understand about the Lord's Supper, and so they told that. And, there were times where they had to know it was a lie, but did it keep them from telling it? No. They kept right on telling it because their mind was made up and they couldn't see or wouldn't see, some of both probably, couldn't and wouldn't, the truth that was right before them. And so what I want to do and take from that, among other things, is, of course, Jesus tells the truth and you can trust him. But I want to take from that, I see how not to be, how to try not to be, to try to be more objective and more fair in reasoning. I can remember there's a young judge that I know, and he said, when he was in the prosecutor's office, that you could get a packet and get a set of facts, and on the surface it would look this way, like the guy's guilty. And said you start working that fact pattern, as they call it, and checking those things and all. And he said then all of a sudden things come to light, but it's not that way. So now what? Well, if you're who you ought to be and what you ought to be, you're going to turn the person loose because you can't prove what he's charged with to be true. That doesn't always happen, but it should always happen, shouldn't it? But it's not as easy because people's emotions get up and all that, and you need somebody that's dispassionate enough to come to it, in our case, and say, well, what does the Bible say? What does God's Word actually teach? Not what is the official position that comes from this school or this lectureship or that lectureship, but this book right here. See? And so, just want to try to avoid that. Believers should not be anxious, he says in verses 14, because you're going to get to make a defense. And even though some of them were imprisoned and beaten and some of them executed, he said, you will be with me. Who's going to come back with him? When he talks about him coming back, who's going to be prominently featured among that group? Yeah, and the people that were killed, rather than deny him, he said, they'll come with me. And so shall you ever be with the Lord. Verses 16 and 17. So terrible will be the hate and the rancor against the faithful because they believe in Jesus and serve Jesus. And so terrible is the hostility and the prejudice that some of their own relatives and friends who reject Christ are going to deliver them to hostile actors. See, so you have to be very careful about who you trust. One of my old professors, whom I think of often with great and deep respect, Dr. William Woodson, told us something one day that just sounded not right to me. But he said, boys, you have to understand, if you have as many as 3 friends that you can absolutely trust, you have been blessed in this world. Now, maybe you've had a bunch more than that. But I found him to be largely correct. There are just not a lot of people that'll stay with you like that. And thus, many of these people died as martyrs, betrayed by their own family. And as far as can be ascertained, all of the apostles, except John, died a violent death. Every one of them. And that's from secular history, but there's no reason to doubt it. Nobody has any reason to lie about that. And it's thought that John lived to be, of course, up into his 90s before he passed away. But he's it. And that was all as the result of Jewish or pagan persecutors. And many of the believers were killed by the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem and elsewhere. And persecution flared up from time to time, again, in some instances, agitated by their own blood relations. About AD 64, many of the Christians in Rome were horribly tortured and mistreated. It was restricted to the imperial city pretty much, but under the Emperor Nero. Nero was, like many tyrants, he just became increasingly paranoid. It is thought by some authorities that some of the things that he exhibited, he might have been syphilitic, and they didn't have antibiotics back then, but whatever it was, he was one wicked man. You know, people have a hard time saying that a wicked person is wicked. Have you ever noticed that? Well, he's this or he's that or he's got this problem or that problem or some other problem. Maybe just mean because he decided to be mean. Maybe that individual just gave himself over to the devil and they're evil because they decided they were going to be evil. And we've just about, like I say, banished that classification. Well, he's got this, he's got that, he needs counseling, he needs this and that. You know, there are people that need all those things. I'm not disputing that, but I'm saying there are some out there who are wicked because they want to be wicked. And anyway, that we see that here. And Nero just horribly tortured people, exposed them to wild animals at the Colosseum and all on and on and on. It's just too repugnant to talk about. And then also relatives and former friends acted as their accusers. That's what had to hurt worse than anything. And the Jews looked upon the brethren as blasphemers because they believed in Jesus, the Messiah. Well, of course, the prophecies were pointing to who? To Messiah, right? And he was a descendant of David, and you just start going back and checking, he really fills all the boxes. But he's just not doing it the way they had decided it needed to be done. He didn't come forth as a conquering war hero, riding a big stallion at the head of a huge army. That's what they were expecting. What they just had decided that's the way it was going to be. But he said, "Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." I'm easy. The burden will be light, and that kind of thing. So he was utterly different than what they needed him to be, or what they wanted him to be. They needed him to be just what he was. Because he came and he could talk to real people on the street. The folks that primarily resented him and built up all of this resistance were the religious elite, the credentialed people, the people that were at the top of society and had everything going, were kind of like some of these oligarchs, what nobody else had, they had. And so, thus they rejected Jesus and led a lot of the people to do it. And the pagans accused the brethren of all kinds of atrocities, cannibalism being one. The pagans resented our brethren because they did not enter into the immoral practices religiously that they endorsed. They had prostitutes that were part of their religious exercise, and that was prominently featured. Then a lot of their, quote, entertainment was barbaric, where you pit men against one another in a fight to the death and bet on who's going to win, and that kind of thing. You put defenseless people in the Colosseum and turn a pack of starving dogs loose on them, and everybody likes to watch that, of course. I mean, what else are you going to do on Saturday afternoon? I mean, you just think about a society that takes pleasure in that kind of a grotesque spectacle. But that's who they were. That's what they were. And all of that Because of what? Well, because they believe that the Messiah is the Messiah, based on the signs, wonders, and miracles that he's done, and the prophecies that he obviously fulfills, and the teaching that he's given them. Verse 18, although they are to suffer physical pain and death, they can never be plucked from the protective hand of God. Nothing is going to happen outside his will, his ultimate will, and he will make all things work together for their highest welfare and their eternal salvation. And at the second advent, or the second coming, they will arise with glorified celestial bodies with no defect and no injury. You know, Brother Paul, I suspect by the time he died, wasn't too much to look at because he'd been stoned and scourged and all repeatedly. And so he had to have borne a lot of evidence of that on his body. And so when we meet him, he won't have that. He'll have a glorified body that is made to last. And so will all the rest. In verse 19, the great essential is that the faithful must persevere and not lose heart, even though they have to go through numerous periods of distress and persecution. You know, our brethren in Bosnia, in Ukraine, now are they're still worshiping and praising God as they can, and you know, are a great example. They are a courageous people, and our brethren in a number of places in the world where it's dangerous to be a Christian or Christian. And I think of our brethren in China, where the Chinese have outlawed the church, and they still continue on, and at great professional and personal risk. And so it costs something to be a disciple of the Lord, and he said, you stay in there, no matter what, you persevere, and when it comes time for you to cross over, I've got you. Through perseverance, they must achieve a true and a full life and be spiritually strong and triumphant in all circumstances. You know, if it becomes necessary, we need to be able to do jail for the Lord. We need to be able to undergo those kinds of extremes if it becomes necessary. So we've had almost 200 years here where that kind of thing is just unheard of. But it's never been unheard of in the world where we live, and it's certainly, as we see it play out now, it's not unheard of. In verse 20, back in verses 8 and 9, Jesus warned the disciples who were then still subject to many, many misconceptions that they must not be misled, expecting the second coming and the final consummation too soon. In verses 10 through 19, he taught them what to expect during the years leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and how they must conduct themselves under persecutions. And now, at last, Jesus tells them of the sign which is to indicate the destruction of the city and the temple, that it's imminent, and it will be something quite different from his second coming. Quite different. And so thus, when the destruction of Jerusalem will not be preceded by the revelation of his messianic glory. That's not what's going to happen. So that's what they thought. But that's not going to happen. He's not coming back then. And by no means, for when the city begins to be threatened by earthly armies, the faithful must know that its destruction at the hands of the armies is at hand. As Vladimir Putin's army is trying to encircling Kyiv, see, people have to know what's coming. And you want to try to get non-combatants and all out of there because it's coming. That's what happened here. We'll see in verse 21, the approach of hostile armies is a signal, Jesus said, to the faithful to flee. Flee the city without delay. And even from the whole environment. Get away from the province of Judea as far as the mountains on the other side of the Jordan. He said, that's where you need to go. And so he gives them a sign of that. And history indeed records that the faithful in Jerusalem and its immediate vicinity obeyed the warning of the Lord, that they did precisely what he told them to do. And when the first signs appeared that Jerusalem is going to be surrounded by the Roman forces, practically all the Christians left the city and the area and went across the Jordan into the Transjordan town of Pella. The modern name of it, I'll see if I can get it, is Kirbet al-Fakil, and where they remained until the destruction of Jerusalem. In verse 22, the faithful are told they must flee the city and as these armies approach them, for the judgments of God are going to be visited on the inhabitants. Can God use a pagan army to do his bidding? Might he be using one today? So he can use who he wants to. And he's doing that here. And because the city did not recognize the time of its visitation, but rejected Jesus and the deliverance that he offered them, even after they have crucified him, he offers that to them. And they rejected that and the glad tidings that he constantly preached among them and had continued to be preached by his followers. Jesus predicted that they would continue to reject him and his envoys. He knew what was going to happen, but he gave them a chance anyway. And so therefore, there was no averting the doom of which he warned. There was not any way to go around that, and there was no way to avert that against which he so yearned to protect them from, as much as he tried, because God gives us a free choice, doesn't he? Could he make people do what they don't want to do? Sure he could. But he created us in whose image? His image. And that's the thing that makes us like God. I'm pretty sure when you see the Lord, he won't look like me in the flesh. That's not the way it is, but it is that one of the things, the distinguishing characteristic is the ability to choose, and God chooses to be good. And that's in his nature. That's the way he determines to be. And he gave us that same ability. So he's not going to force these Jews. He appealed to them, sure, but he didn't coerce them. And so when we go out to preach and teach and what have you, we don't coerce people, do we? We don't have any authority to coerce anybody. If we can't convince them through a reasoning and through the words of Scripture, then they just won't be convinced. That's their choice. We want them and pray that they'll make the right choice. But all of these warnings in the Old Testament that people should pay the penalty in full if they forsake righteousness and truth are going to have their fulfillment. All of that is going to have its fulfillment. Verse 23, so great will be the distress in the Jewish land in those days of retribution, that instead of motherhood being a joy and a blessing, it will become a curse and a source of affliction. It is told during the siege on Jerusalem that hunger became so intense that some ate their children. Horrible kind of thing. Starvation will make people insane. And I don't have an enemy that I would starve. That kind of inhumanity is inexcusable. And so it moves anybody with a heart to see all these Ukrainian mothers with their little children and their husbands at the train station, putting them on the train to Poland, knowing that they might very well not ever see one another again. And that's going to mark those children, those women for the rest of their lives, no matter what happens in the conflict. And so we should continue to pray with great fervor that these hostilities can end. I don't know the lady's name. I don't keep up with actors and what have you, but there's a lady that's an actor here or some kind of celebrity. And one of our parents is Russian and one of them is Ukrainian. And there's a lot of that. This war would be like us going to war with Mexico. I mean, how many kin folks do you think are on either side of the border? The kids intermarried, and what have you. I mean, it's just, I don't know, a lot. So you're going to ask pit those soldiers against each other and they're kin to each other? So I hope more of those Russian boys, if they had something to fight about, they would fight, but I hope more of them will say, nope. No, sir, not going to be part of that. But I just have my doubts. I hope to be proven wrong. It's a terrible, terrible thing to see, and that's the kind of thing that befell the land of Israel. And the distress of those Jews in those days, the retribution that was brought down upon them, made motherhood something that was a source of affliction. You can't feed your child. You can't take care of your child. You're trying to run with a little child that's wore out and trying to get them to be quiet, and they're distressed and they're not going to be quiet, and on and on and on. I mean, it's bad for soldiers to get caught in a bind like that, get behind the lines, not where they're not safe. But just think about a defenseless woman with her little children. Even a merely superficial acquaintance. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote a lengthy book about the history of the Jewish wars and what have you. And if you read about that, it's just appalling what took place. And it makes one to realize the truth of the Lord's prophecy. In verse 24, the defenders of the city are either going to be slain or scattered as prisoners of war among the nations of the world, and Jerusalem will fall into the hands of pagan nations and be dominated by them until the times of these nations are fulfilled. And that probably means up until the end of the present day world order. When Christ will come, then with divine majesty and power, and establish the eternal phase of his kingdom on a new earth with a new heavens, whatever that means. Our brethren are in a big argument about that. None of them know exactly how that's going to be manifested. The older I get, the more I recognize sometimes brethren will get in a fight with each other about something God didn't clarify. If he didn't clarify that very specifically, reckon I ought to try? Y'all don't think I'm qualified to do that? I've read 8 or 10 books before. See, I mean, if he didn't clarify it, Lindell's going to leave it alone. And I'd suggest to my brethren to leave it alone. But when he comes back, he's going, you see the picture of the heavenly city coming down, and all that's symbolic. We don't know exactly how that's going to manifest, but it will. And you can have a place there. You do have a place there. And we look forward to that time. The first part of the prophecy in these verses is literally true at the destruction of Jerusalem. And after the siege of about 5 months by a mighty Roman army, it was under the command of General Titus, and he was the son of the Roman Emperor Vespasian. They completely destroyed the city and plundered the city and the temple, and they killed thousands and tens of thousands of Jews, some estimates over 1 million. Men, women, children. And similar to what we're seeing. And when they were satiated in their slaughter, they carried off the remainder, except for the weak and the aged, because they killed them with no mercy. And so there was not a single Jew left in the city. And for many years after the destruction of the city, no Jew was allowed to be there or in the surrounding area. They were allowed to go to the hills surrounding the city and mourn the loss 1 day a year. And thus the prophecies came true because they would not receive their Messiah. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for being kind and listening. I appreciate you.